Well, of course, more coverage from the World Economic Forum from our team there through the afternoon. In New Zealand, the Prime Minister there, Jacinda Ardern, has announced that she's going to resign with immediate effect. She says she doesn't have enough left in the tank to lead her party, New Zealand's Labour Party, through another election, and it's time for someone else to take over. Ardern will probably be remembered for many things, including her leadership of New Zealand after a mass shooting during the COVID pandemic, but in many ways, her identity as a woman, and maybe as a woman younger than previous leaders in New Zealand, has also appeared to be a big issue in that country's politics, perhaps. Professor Amanda Gouws is a distinguished professor in political science at the University of Stellenbosch. Professor Gouws, good afternoon to you. Over the last sort of 15 years, in many older democracies, we've seen a wave of populism. Italy, the United States, Brazil, Britain. And these have seen generally men, generally white men, a little bit of a tinge of prejudice to their leadership. New Zealand seemed to be different. Jacinda Ardern seemed to be different. What was different about them?
Good afternoon. Yes, I think that what makes Jacinda Ardern important is that she was a young woman, under the age of 40 when she became the Prime Minister. And she was a very competent Prime Minister, especially during the COVID time. But she also brought other leadership skills to the table that we often don't see in men, that of empathy, of listening and working with a team. When she resigned, she, for example, said that she didn't govern alone, she governed with a team. So I think that's what people will remember her for that team spirit and bringing, I think, for the first time in New Zealand history, certain qualities that women have to the table as a political leader.
New Zealand, in some ways, has been slightly further ahead of the curve than many other countries. It's had 2 female prime ministers before this. I had to scratch my head about this, but I think I'm right. It was the first country to actually allow women to vote in general elections over a century ago. And yet, somehow, Ardern's gender was still a big issue.
Well, I think, gender is always an issue because there are not many women who lead countries. And I think there is, in her case, another group of young women leaders, Finland, Norway, for example, in that age category that has led their countries in the last 5 or 10 years. So, but these are smaller countries, more homogeneous countries, and countries that, did not actually struggle with this wave of populism. But New Zealand is, as you rightly point out, ahead of the curve. And I think that she and these young leaders, women leaders that we've seen in the last decade, really sets a trend to show that women can lead, that young women can lead, and that they bring certain qualities as leaders to the table that men don't, and specifically populist men. If we think about Trump, we think about Bolsonaro, we think about Boris Johnson, the me, and the self-centeredness. And what women leaders show is the living relationality. In other words, living and governing in terms of relationships, not in terms of the self-centeredness. And I think that's really important.
I suppose the strange thing to it all is that, and I mean, we've seen this many times with the leader. You will have a leader who outside of their country is very popular and inside of their country isn't that popular. And if she was hugely popular, her party would be urging her to stay on.
Well, she was very popular, but that popularity seemed to have declined. But we also need to see this in terms of her party, the Labour Party, whose popularity seemed to have declined. And that, of course, has an impact on her as a leader. And I think she's looked at this. And she's looked at whether she, as a young mother, because it's also important for, I think those of us who have children, and I remember myself when I was that age, you never get that time with young children back if you work all the time. So that she's looked at this and decided that's what she wants to do next, is to be at home or, doing a job that's not so demanding. But I think a lot of what's happening to her needs to also be related back to her party and how that party has been faring. And it seems that that there's a decline in the popularity of the Labour Party.
There seems to be a sense among some people in New Zealand society, and it seems from what I can see that it is perhaps elder men who have a huge sense of resentment against her. And I mean, people use words about her that they don't really use about other political leaders. Where does that come from? I mean, is that just a sort of form of prejudice that we've seen that seems to be directed at women in politics or women in public life? I mean, you could argue we see the same, for example, in discussions around the British royal family, where you have things, men will say things about women on social media that they don't say about other men.
Exactly. And, I think we need to take this back also to their neighbouring country, Australia, where when they had a woman prime minister, said the most horrific things about her, not only on social media, but in public. And it shows us, and that also came from older men. And it is the absolutely lack of acceptance of women as political leaders. And I'm involved in a research project at the moment, and we're looking at increasing electoral violence. Now, what that means is that women who run as candidates for political parties, how they are exposed to name-calling, to insults, to gender stereotypes, and to violence. And it is increasing all over the world. So, I think this is where what we call the patriarchal dividend, where men actually think that they are entitled to certain positions as political leaders, and that they are actually not going to give up power very easily to women. One would have thought maybe in democracies that are old democracies, we're not fighting those battles anymore, but that's not true. We see a recurrence now of this sort of shaming women who are actually political leaders and who are doing a good job. I mean, she has done a very good job as a prime minister, and yet there is this resentment towards her.
Some of it seems to be around what happened during COVID-19. I'm not taking anything away from what you said. I think everything. I'm sort of nodding my head as you say it. But and again, it seems to be people who look like me, unfortunately, white men, who seem to rally against, who seem to rail against any kind of lockdown, any kind of restriction, any kind of requirement for a vaccine. You see it on WhatsApp groups. You see it all over the place. And then it seems in this case her gender was weaponized against her. And I wonder if there may be an international sort of feature to this, that we've seen a lot of people somehow seem to be railing against COVID-19 regulations. We've seen it here too. A lot of the people who've been speaking about it here have been white men, people who've been railing against these regulations. I wonder if there's something in that. There seems to be something that's political, that's around COVID-19, that may be with us for some time.
Well, and I also think she was one of the people who called for an early lockdown, and it was quite successful. When other countries really struggled to bring the COVID pandemic under control, it wasn't the case in New Zealand. But I think what people are also, or men, resent is the fact that she, for example, would appear on television during that time in her pajamas with a baby on her arm. So, that personifies women and women's qualities. I think men think of that as weakness. And that, I think, is really problematic. So if we look at the countries where men like Trump, for example, raved on about, there is no such thing as COVID, there is no pandemic, what happened to those countries in comparison what happened to New Zealand? So if you look at it on a rational and reasonable level, she did the right thing. But, the irrationality of populist leaders, for example, is just, there's no arguing with it. And that's what, I think has come to haunt her.
It's hard to judge a leader. And I mean, people will be writing sort of assessments now about her. Sometimes it's really only years later, decisions that seem quite strange now can sometimes turn out to be absolutely correct. How do you think New Zealand, I mean, maybe the world New Zealand will have different memories of Jacinda Ardern, but how do you think New Zealand's going to remember her?
Well, you think, I think that once we acknowledge women as political leaders, where we don't have to take special measures to get women into politics, she will be acknowledged for her contribution. But as long as there's also an erasure of women's political histories under patriarchy, maybe, she will not be remembered for what she did. And I think this is the one thing that we need to bear in mind, that there is a lot of erasure going on around women's political histories, about their contributions. And the ones who are remembered, like Maggie Thatcher or Golda Meir, for example, are the ones who were like men. They acted like men, they thought about policies like men, and they really didn't do much to change conditions for women. So those are your big leaders. But the ones who do things differently, I think until patriarchy would acknowledge women as competent political leaders, I don't know what their political histories will look like.
Professor Amanda Gouws, thank you. I really appreciate the time. So much more to discuss on this subject, actually. Distinguished Professor in Political Science at the University of Stellenbosch.